At 78, people expect you to speak softly about your life, as if anything louder might shatter what little time you have left. They expect gratitude. They expect you to smile when you talk about your children, to say phrases like, "I wouldn't change a thing," and "it was all worth it." And for most of my life, I said those things too, not because they were entirely true, but because they were easier than telling the full story. The truth, I've learned, is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives late, wearing comfortable shoes, and sits beside you quietly while you drink your morning tea. That is how it came to me, not during a crisis, not during an argument, but one ordinary morning when I realized I no longer recognized the woman in my own reflection. I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen I'd cooked in for over 50 years, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. The house was silent in that particular way it only becomes when children are long gone and no one needs you immediately. No phone ringing, no door opening, no voice calling mom. And instead of feeling relief, which everyone says you should feel at this age, I felt something else, a hollow space where my sense of self used to live. I remember looking down at my hands, spotted now with age, knuckles swollen, nails short and practical as they'd always been, and thinking, when did my life become entirely about holding everyone else together? And when did I stop holding myself at all? I raised my children well. I know that. They are educated, capable, respected. They don't struggle in the ways I once did. They had opportunities I never dreamed of when I was their age. I packed lunches, stayed up late sewing costumes, attended school meetings, wiped tears, swallowed my own disappointment so theirs wouldn't grow heavier. I showed up, over and over again, even when I was tired, even when I was lonely, even when parts of me were quietly breaking. And I do not regret that. I truly don't. Loving them was never the mistake. But somewhere between being needed and being depended on, between being supportive and being invisible, I lost myself. Not all at once. That would have been easier to notice. No, I lost myself slowly, politely, the way women of my generation were taught to do, by stepping aside, by saying, "It doesn't matter," when it did, by choosing peace over truth, harmony over honesty, sacrifice over selfhood. And at 78, when no one is asking you to be strong anymore, you finally have the quiet to hear what you've been ignoring for decades. I grew up in a time when women were praised for endurance, not identity. You were a good woman if you kept the family together, if your children turned out well, if your husband felt supported. Nobody asked who you were beyond that. Nobody asked what you wanted once the house was clean and dinner was on the table. And so I learned early that wanting too much was dangerous. Wanting space, wanting rest, wanting recognition, those were indulgences, not rights. I married young, as most of us did, and slipped easily into the role expected of me: wife, mother, caretaker. The titles came naturally. The disappearance happened quietly. There were moments, small ones, when I felt myself surface. Sometimes it was late at night when everyone was asleep and I sat alone with a book I barely had time to read. Sometimes it was when music played on the radio and I remembered the girl I once was, the one who loved to write, who imagined a life not defined entirely by service. But those moments passed. Morning always came, responsibilities always returned, and I told myself what I had been taught to tell myself. This is what love looks like. When my children grew older, the sacrifices didn't stop. They only changed shape. I worried constantly. I adjusted my opinions so I wouldn't offend them. I offered help even when it wasn't asked for. I said yes when my body wanted to say no. I became careful with my words, afraid that honesty might be mistaken for criticism. I wanted to be needed but not resented, loved but not burdensome, useful but not visible. It is a delicate balance, and one that costs more than anyone admits. The moment of clarity didn't come with tears or anger. It came with exhaustion, a deep bone-level exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix. I realized I was tired not because of age, but because I had spent a lifetime earning my place through usefulness. And now, at 78, when my usefulness had diminished in the eyes of others, I was left asking a question I had avoided my entire life. Who am I when I am no longer needed? That question frightened me more than aging itself. I don't blame my children, that's important to say. They didn't ask me to disappear. They simply grew up in a world where mothers give endlessly, quietly, without complaint. They learned what they were shown, and I showed them a woman who put herself last with a smile, a woman who believed love meant endurance, a woman who confused self-erasure with devotion. If there is regret in my heart, it is not resentment toward them, it is grief for myself. At 78, I am finally old enough to tell the truth without fear of punishment. I don't regret raising them. I regret losing myself. I regret not teaching my children what it looks like when a woman values her own life alongside theirs. I regret not protecting my inner world with the same ferocity I protected their futures. And yet even now, I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with clarity. Because the truth is, it's not too late to choose differently. I didn't come to this realization because something dramatic happened. No one abandoned me, no one shouted, no one slammed a door. What happened was quieter and perhaps more unsettling. I woke up one day and realized I was living a life built entirely around the past. And for the first time, I wondered what it might mean to live the remainder of my life, however long that may be, with myself at the center, not the margins. That thought scared me. It also felt like freedom. And this is where my story truly begins. The first time I chose myself, it didn't look brave. It didn't look dramatic. No one would have applauded it if they'd seen it happen. In fact, if I'm honest, most people wouldn't have noticed at all. That's how deeply I had trained myself to disappear. Even my resistance learned to whisper. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that used to belong to my children without question. Sundays had always been theirs, calls, visits, errands, favors. Even after they grew up, married, moved away, Sunday remained the day I stayed available, just in case someone needed something. I never made plans. I never said I was busy. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was flexibility. But that Sunday, sitting in my armchair with a blanket over my knees and an ache in my lower back that had been lingering for weeks, I felt something inside me harden, not into anger, but into resolve. The phone rang around noon. I knew before I answered who it would be. Mothers always know. My son's name lit up the screen, and with it came the familiar tightening in my chest, the mental preparation to listen carefully, to respond gently, to rearrange whatever small comfort I'd managed to build for myself that day. My thumb hovered over the green button, and for a brief moment I considered letting it ring. That thought alone felt rebellious, almost sinful. What kind of mother ignores her child's call? The kind who is tired, a quiet voice inside me answered. The kind who is 78 and finally listening to her body. I answered, of course. Old habits don't break in a single afternoon. His voice was warm, casual, already halfway into the request before I'd fully said hello. He needed a favor, nothing terrible, nothing urgent, just something that would require me to get dressed, leave the house, stand for a long time, and pretend my joints didn't hurt as much as they did. I listened, nodding instinctively even though he couldn't see me, already shaping the yes in my mouth. And then something unexpected happened. My body spoke before my training could stop it. "I can't today," I said. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and unfamiliar. I felt my heart race. I waited for the correction to follow, the laugh, the apology, the explanation that would turn my refusal into something more acceptable. But it didn't come. I simply repeated it, more softly this time. I'm not feeling up to it. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough. In that silence lived decades of expectation, the version of me he knew, the one who always managed, who never complained, who found a way even when there wasn't one. I braced myself for disappointment, irritation, perhaps even guilt disguised as concern. Instead, he said, "Oh, okay, just that, 2 words." And then after a beat, "We'll figure something else out." When the call ended, I sat there stunned, staring at the phone in my hand as if it had betrayed me by not exploding. Nothing bad had happened. The world hadn't collapsed. My son hadn't accused me of being selfish or cold. He hadn't reminded me of all I'd done for him in the past as leverage against this one small refusal. The guilt I'd prepared myself to swallow never arrived, and yet, instead of relief, I felt something closer to grief. Because in that moment, I realized how many times I'd said yes out of fear rather than love. The rest of that afternoon passed differently than any Sunday before it. I stayed in my chair. I let my tea grow cold again, but this time I didn't rush to reheat it. I watched the light move across the floor. I allowed myself to be still without narrating my usefulness in my head. And slowly memories surfaced, not the big moments everyone remembers, but the small ones I'd buried. Times I'd wanted to rest but didn't. Times I'd needed help but stayed silent. Times I felt invisible in rooms full of people I loved. These memories didn't accuse me, they simply existed, asking to be acknowledged at last. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner for myself, I noticed how unfamiliar it felt to cook without anyone else in mind. No preferences to consider, no timing to manage, no fear of disappointment. I ate slowly, tasting my food instead of swallowing it between tasks. It felt almost indulgent, and that word, indulgent, made me laugh quietly. Imagine thinking that peace at 78 was something to apologize for. Of course, the guilt came later. It always does. It crept in that night as I lay in bed replaying the phone call. A familiar voice in my head began its work. You should have pushed through. He needed you. What if this is the beginning of them pulling away? I had lived with that voice for so long that I'd mistaken it for wisdom. But now something had shifted. Another voice answered it, calmer, steadier. What if this is the beginning of you staying? That question changed the shape of everything. In the days that followed, I noticed how deeply my identity had been tied to availability. If I wasn't doing something for someone else, I felt untethered, unsure of my worth. I realized how often I checked my phone, not out of curiosity, but out of obligation. How silence had once felt like abandonment instead of rest. This wasn't something my children had done to me. This was something I had practiced for a lifetime. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I began making small, almost invisible changes. I stopped explaining myself so much. I let calls go to voicemail when I was tired. I chose comfort over appearance, rest over reputation. Each choice felt freeing and terrifying, like stepping onto unfamiliar ground after decades of walking the same narrow path. Some days I felt strong. Other days I felt like a traitor to my own past. The hardest part wasn't my children's reactions. It was unlearning the belief that love must hurt to be real. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered from the outside compared to the storm inside me. My children adapted, slowly, imperfectly, but they adapted. The real battle was between the woman I had been trained to be and the woman I was becoming. One lived for approval, the other was learning to live for truth. At 78, I was not reinventing myself, I was reclaiming myself. And with every small refusal, every quiet boundary, I felt something return. Not youth, not energy, but dignity. A sense that my life still belonged to me, that the years that I had left, however many they were, did not have to be spent earning love through exhaustion. That night, as I turned off the lamp and settled into the darkness, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. It wasn't borrowed, it wasn't conditional, it was mine. And I understood then that choosing peace over pleasing my children wasn't an act of abandonment. It was an act of survival. The change didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived the way most real transformations do, quietly, awkwardly, almost politely, and then stayed long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. After that Sunday, after that first small refusal, I didn't suddenly become a different woman. I didn't wake up fearless or firm or fluent in boundaries. What changed was subtler and far more dangerous to the life I had built. I hesitated before saying yes, and hesitation, I learned, is often interpreted as rejection by people who are used to unquestioned devotion. The first signs came in the tone of my children's voices, not anger, not yet, but something cooler. Conversations shortened, calls became more transactional. Where once there had been casual warmth, there was now calculation. I could feel them adjusting, recalibrating the version of me they carried in their heads. It unsettled them. It unsettled me even more. For decades, I had been reliable in the most predictable way. I bent, I absorbed, I adapted. Now, without meaning to, I was becoming unpredictable. One afternoon, my daughter, my eldest, called to ask if I could watch the grandchildren for a weekend. She said it the way she always had, already assuming the answer. I felt the familiar pressure rise in my chest. I loved my grandchildren deeply. They were bright, loud, exhausting little mirrors of the past. But that weekend, my body was already protesting. My knees swelled when I stood too long. My sleep had been restless. And more than that, something inside me resisted the idea of once again emptying myself completely and calling it love. "I can't this weekend," I said. My voice didn't shake, but my hands did. There it was again, the pause, longer this time, heavier. "Well," she said finally, "I guess we'll have to cancel our plans." The words weren't sharp, but they landed like a reprimand. A familiar script began playing in my mind. Look what you've caused. Look how your selfishness inconveniences everyone. I almost backtracked, almost offered alternatives, almost apologized for my aging body as if it were a personal failure. Instead, I did something new. I stayed quiet. "I'm sorry," she added, and somehow made it sound like an accusation. After the call ended, I sat alone at the kitchen table and felt the old guilt seep in, thick and suffocating. This was the guilt I knew well, the kind that doesn't shout, but corrodes. It whispered that I was changing in the wrong direction, that I was becoming cold, that motherhood, once chosen, should never be revised. And for the first time since I began this quiet rebellion, I wondered if peace came at too high a cost. That night, sleep refused me. I lay awake replaying the conversation, dissecting every word. I thought about all the weekends I had rearranged my life around my children's needs, canceled plans, ignored pain, swallowed resentment. I remembered rocking babies on swollen feet, driving long distances when I should have been resting, saying yes when my body screamed no. None of that had ever been counted as sacrifice. It was simply expected. And now one refusal felt like betrayal. That realization hurt more than I was prepared for. The next few weeks followed a similar rhythm, small boundaries met with small resistances, not open conflict, my children weren't cruel, but subtle shifts that stung all the same. I noticed I was no longer the first person they called with good news. Invitations came later, if at all. There was a carefulness now, as if they were unsure which version of me would answer the phone. I told myself this was temporary, that adjustment always feels like loss before it feels like balance, but some days the loneliness was sharp enough to make me doubt everything. I began to ask myself questions I had avoided my entire adult life. Who am I if I am not constantly needed? What remains when my usefulness fades? These questions didn't come with comforting answers. They exposed a hollow space I had filled for years with obligation, and sitting with that emptiness was terrifying. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, studying my reflection more closely than I had in years. The woman looking back at me seemed unfamiliar. Aged, yes, but also strangely alert. There was a steadiness in her eyes I didn't remember earning. I realized then that I had spent decades being seen through my children's needs rather than my humanity, and now that lens was shifting, the image felt distorted to everyone, including me. The hardest moment came during a family dinner a month later. We were all gathered around the table, laughter forced but present, conversation skimming safely across the surface. At one point, my son joked, "Mom's finally learning to say no." The words were light, but the room went quiet. I smiled because that's what mothers do, but inside something tightened. Finally learning, as if it were a trick or a phase, as if the years I had spent silencing myself were a deficiency I was now correcting too late. No one meant harm, I knew that, but intention doesn't erase impact, and the impact was this. My growth felt like a disruption to the family narrative, not a natural evolution. Later that night, after everyone had left, I cried alone in my bedroom, not because I wanted to go back, I didn't, but because becoming myself had cost me a kind of belonging I hadn't realized was conditional. The grief was real. It deserved space, so I let it come. I cried for the mother I had been, the one who believed love meant endless availability. I cried for the years I'd traded rest for relevance. I cried because growth at this age felt lonelier than I had imagined. And somewhere in those tears, a truth settled. Peace doesn't always arrive wrapped in warmth. Sometimes it comes disguised as distance. The next morning, something in me steadied. The sadness didn't disappear, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a passage. I realized that my children were not punishing me. They were grieving the version of me that made their lives easier. And that grief, uncomfortable as it was, belonged to them, not me. That understanding didn't make things painless, but it made them clearer. I began to see that love without boundaries had trained us all poorly. It had taught my children that my limits were negotiable and taught me that my worth was earned through endurance. Undoing that lesson was bound to feel like betrayal to them and to the part of me that still believed suffering was proof of devotion. But here's what no one tells you. When you stop abandoning yourself, people who benefited from your absence will notice, and that doesn't mean you're wrong. By the end of that month, I no longer rushed to fill the silence when a call ended awkwardly. I no longer explained my choices in long, apologetic sentences. I didn't harden, I softened inward. I learned to sit with discomfort without translating it into guilt. And slowly, something remarkable happened. I began to feel whole. Not approved, not praised, whole. And that wholeness, fragile and new, mattered more than being liked in rooms where my pain had once been invisible. That was when I understood that choosing peace wasn't a single decision. It was a series of small, lonely moments where I honored my truth even when it wasn't celebrated. And that, at 78, was the bravest thing I had ever done. If the earlier weeks had been quiet adjustments, this phase arrived with edges, Resistance, I learned, doesn't always announce itself as anger. Sometimes it shows up as concern, dressed in familiarity, as questions that sound caring but are rooted in fear. My children didn't sit me down for an intervention or accuse me outright of changing. That would have been easier. Instead, they began circling the subject, each in their own way, trying to understand what they could no longer control. It started with my son. He invited me for coffee one afternoon, just the two of us. That alone should have told me something. For years, our conversations had happened in motion, between obligations, never requiring intentional time. When he suggested we sit, uninterrupted, I felt both warmed and wary. Something important was coming, I could tell. We sat by the window of a small cafe, the kind I used to avoid because it felt indulgent. I ordered tea. He ordered nothing at first, tapping his fingers against the table as if rehearsing lines in his head. "Mom," he finally said, "are you okay?" That question carried more weight than it should have. It wasn't about my health, it was about my compliance. "I'm fine," I said, and for once it wasn't a polite lie. He nodded slowly, studying my face as if searching for cracks. "You just seem different lately." Different. The word hovered between us, neutral on the surface, charged underneath. I waited. I had learned that silence now belonged to me, too. "You don't come around as much," he continued. "You don't jump in like you used to. We're just worried." Worried, I thought, has always been the most respectable way to express discomfort with change. "I still care," I said carefully. "I just need more rest, more space." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "But that's not like you." There it was, the unspoken rule finally spoken aloud. I had spent decades shaping myself into a role so completely that deviation felt like malfunction. "I'm still me," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice, "just not exhausted anymore." He frowned, not angrily, but with confusion. That expression hurt more than accusation would have, because it told me he wasn't resisting me out of cruelty, but out of unfamiliarity. He had never known me any other way. "But Mom," he said gently, "we've always counted on you." The word counted landed heavily. It implied dependence, not partnership. It reminded me how often love had been measured by my availability rather than my presence. "I know," I said, "and I was glad to be there, but I can't be everything anymore." He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he just looked away, jaw tight, and nodded. The conversation ended politely, unresolved. When we parted, he hugged me longer than usual, not with affection, but with uncertainty, as if he were saying goodbye to a version of me he wasn't sure would return. That evening, the familiar guilt returned, sharper this time. I questioned myself again. Was I being unfair? Was this boundary necessary or merely stubborn? Old instincts urged me to smooth things over, to reassure him that nothing fundamental had changed. But something had, and pretending otherwise would have been another quiet betrayal, this time of myself. The next confrontation came from an unexpected direction, my own sister. She called one night, her voice brisk, efficient, the way it had always been. "I hear you're saying no to the kids," she said without preamble. I smiled bitterly. News travels fast when women stop complying. "I'm choosing more carefully," I replied. She sighed. "Just be careful you don't push them away. Children remember these things." That sentence sliced deep. It carried generations of instruction, the warning that a mother's worth is judged retroactively, that love is proven through endurance, and that regret is the punishment for deviation. "I'm not pushing anyone away," I said quietly. "I'm standing still." She didn't understand, and I realized she wasn't meant to. She had built her life on similar sacrifices and couldn't afford to question them. My boundaries felt like criticism of her choices, even though they weren't. Sometimes people resist your healing because it threatens the logic of their suffering. What surprised me most was how much strength it took to remain gentle while being misunderstood. It would have been easier to harden, to retreat behind defensiveness, but I didn't want distance. I wanted truth, and truth, I was learning, requires patience. Over time, the resistance became more direct. Requests came with added explanations, as if my no required justification now. When I declined, I could hear disappointment creep into voices. Not anger, but recalculation. My role was being renegotiated in real time. One afternoon, my daughter said something that finally clarified everything. "You've earned your rest, but we're still adjusting." Adjusting, that word held both honesty and loss. I nodded, feeling something loosen inside me. For the first time, someone acknowledged that this wasn't just difficult for them, it was new. I'm adjusting too, to myself. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something soften in her eyes. Not full understanding, but curiosity, the beginning of recognition. That moment mattered more than she knew. Still, reconciliation didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in pauses that grew less tense, in visits that didn't revolve entirely around my usefulness, in conversations that lingered after needs had been met. I began to redefine myself not through resistance, but through consistency. I showed up when I said I would. I rested when I needed to. I stopped explaining my boundaries as if they were apologies, and slowly my children learned where I stood, not as a resource, but as a person. There were setbacks, of course. Old patterns don't dissolve quietly. Sometimes guilt crept back in when I heard disappointment in a voice or sensed distance. But now I recognized it for what it was, an echo of a life where love had been conditional on self-erasure. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I realized something quietly revolutionary. I was no longer measuring my days by how needed I felt. I was measuring them by how honest I had been with myself. That shift changed everything. I didn't stop being a mother, I stopped being a martyr. And in that space, between who I had been and who I was becoming, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years: respect. Not just from others, but from myself. It was fragile, still forming, but it was real. And for the first time, reconciliation wasn't about returning to old roles. It was about allowing new ones to exist. Acceptance does not arrive like a celebration. It arrives quietly, unevenly, often disguised as discomfort. That was the season I entered next. Not the bold relief I had imagined, but a slower reckoning with the space I had created in my own life. Space, I learned, can feel like freedom one moment and abandonment the next, especially when you've spent decades filling every empty corner with other people's needs. There were mornings when I woke up calm, almost surprised by how light my chest felt. No urgent phone calls waiting, no plans stitched together out of obligation, just time, unclaimed, unassigned. Those mornings felt like a gift I didn't quite know how to unwrap. I would sit at the table longer than necessary, letting my tea cool, watching sunlight move across the wall. I told myself this was what peace looked like. But then there were afternoons when the silence turned sharp, when the absence of requests felt less like rest and more like rejection. I would catch myself wondering whether my children were upset with me, whether they were keeping distance on purpose, whether I had misunderstood the cost of my boundaries. Guilt has a way of slipping in when the noise dies down. It asks questions that sound responsible but are rooted in fear. Have I gone too far? Am I being selfish now? Will they stop needing me altogether? Those questions haunted me in the quietest hours, not because I believed them fully, but because they echoed a lifetime of conditioning. I had been taught, subtly and consistently, that a good mother is always available, always flexible, always secondary to everyone else's needs. Stepping outside that belief felt like stepping onto thin ice. Even when I didn't fall, I expected to. One afternoon, my daughter called unexpectedly, not with a request, just to talk. That alone made my heart jump. I braced myself, unsure whether this conversation would pull me backward or allow me to stand where I was. We spoke about ordinary things at first, her work, the weather, small frustrations. And then, after a pause, she said, "I miss how things used to be sometimes." The old me would have apologized instantly, would have promised to come by more often, to help more, to fix the discomfort. I felt the reflex rise, sharp and familiar, but I didn't act on it. "I do too," I said honestly, "but I don't miss how tired I was." There was silence on the line, long enough to make my stomach tighten. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," she finally said. That sentence landed gently, but it landed deep, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. For years, my exhaustion had been invisible, mistaken for capability. Hearing it named felt like someone finally seeing the weight I had set down. Still, acceptance wasn't linear. For every moment of understanding, there was another moment of doubt. I noticed it especially when special occasions approached, birthdays, holidays, gatherings that used to revolve around my preparation and presence. This time, others stepped in. Things were done differently, not better or worse, just different. Watching that shift stirred complicated emotions. Relief, yes, but also a strange grief. I had poured so much of myself into being the backbone of those moments that stepping back felt like erasing proof of my love. I had to remind myself repeatedly that love does not disappear when effort does. One evening, after a family gathering I attended only briefly, I returned home earlier than usual. I took off my coat, sat in my chair, and felt an unexpected heaviness settle in my chest. The house was quiet again. No one needed anything from me. No one followed me home. That's when the guilt surfaced strongest, not loud, but persuasive. It whispered that I was becoming unnecessary, that I had traded usefulness for comfort, that maybe this peace came at too high a price. I let myself feel it fully instead of pushing it away. I sat there and allowed the sadness to exist without judgment. And slowly, something shifted. I realized the guilt wasn't telling me the truth. It was mourning an identity that had defined me for decades. I wasn't missing my children in that moment. I was missing who I used to be for them. That distinction mattered. Once I saw it clearly, I could grieve without retreating. I could acknowledge the loss without undoing the boundary. That was new. For most of my life, grief had been a signal to sacrifice. Now it became a signal to reflect. I began filling my days intentionally, not with obligations, but with small acts of choice. Walking a little longer than planned, reading without interruption, sitting in places simply because they felt peaceful. These weren't grand changes, but they were mine. And with each choice, my sense of self grew sturdier. I was no longer borrowing my worth from how needed I was. I was learning to feel complete without constant validation. The guilt didn't disappear overnight. It softened gradually, like a bruise healing from the inside out. Sometimes it returned unexpectedly, when a child sounded stressed, when I heard about a problem I could have helped solve. But now, instead of rushing to fix everything, I paused. Is my help being asked or assumed? Would stepping in serve them or soothe my own discomfort? Those questions became anchors. They didn't make decisions easy, but they made them honest. And honesty brought a deeper kind of freedom, one that wasn't loud or triumphant, but steady. The freedom of knowing I was acting from choice, not fear, from love, not obligation. One night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and noticed something subtle but undeniable. My face looked calmer. not happier in a dramatic way, but settled, as if I had finally stopped bracing myself. That's when I understood something essential. Peace isn't the absence of guilt, it's the ability to carry it without letting it decide for you. I hadn't abandoned my children, I had returned to myself. And in doing so, I was learning how to love them and myself in a way that didn't require disappearance. There came a point when I realized I was no longer rehearsing explanations in my head. That was the first sign that something inside me had changed. For months, every boundary I set felt temporary, like a line drawn in sand I expected to redraw at the first wave of discomfort. I defended my choices silently, even when no one challenged them. I was always ready to justify myself, to prove that I wasn't selfish, careless, or unloving. But slowly, without ceremony, that tension loosened. One afternoon, my son asked if I could come over to help with something on short notice. Nothing urgent, just inconvenient. I looked at my calendar, at the quiet afternoon I had planned for myself, and felt no rush of panic. No guilt rose to the surface. No inner debate followed. "I can't today," I said gently, "but I hope you understand." And I meant it, not as a defense, not as a test, but as a simple truth. After we hung up, I waited for the familiar wave of regret. It never came. Instead, there was calm, not the fragile calm that feels borrowed from good circumstances, but a deeper steadiness, the kind that comes from alignment. I hadn't chosen against him, I had chosen for myself, and for the first time, those two things didn't feel like opposites. That's when I understood. Boundaries stop feeling like walls once you trust the ground you're standing on. Earlier, every no felt like a risk of conflict, of distance, of losing love. Now, my no felt rooted, supported by a growing sense of who I was beyond my role. I wasn't withdrawing from my family. I was no longer abandoning myself to stay connected. Identity, I discovered, doesn't arrive all at once. It rebuilds quietly through repetition, through choosing the same truth again and again until it no longer feels radical. I began to notice how my body responded differently to daily life. My shoulders didn't stay tense during conversations. I slept more deeply. I laughed more easily, not because everything was perfect, but because I wasn't constantly bracing for the next demand. Peace was no longer something I experienced only when no one needed me. It stayed, even when they did. The shift showed up in subtle ways. I spoke more slowly. I listened without planning how to fix things. When my children shared problems, I didn't automatically offer solutions. Sometimes I simply said, "That sounds hard," and trusted that they would find their own way forward. That trust felt radical, not in them, but in myself. Trust that I didn't need to be essential to be loved. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old patterns. Reflexes built over decades don't disappear quietly. Occasionally, I still felt the urge to overextend, to prove my value through effort. But now those urges felt familiar rather than commanding. I could notice them without obeying them. That distinction mattered, because identity isn't just who you believe you are, it's who you stop proving to be. As weeks passed, my relationships adjusted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some interactions became simpler, less emotionally charged. Others grew more honest. Without my constant presence filling every gap, my children showed different sides of themselves, more capable, more reflective, sometimes even more appreciative. Not always. Growth doesn't erase tension, but it changes its shape. I realized I was no longer measuring my worth by how often I was called or how urgently I was needed. My days had structure that belonged to me, morning routines that didn't revolve around anticipation of requests, evenings that felt complete without exhaustion. Peace, I learned, becomes permanent when it's practiced, not when it's granted. One evening, as I walked home after a long stroll, I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet confidence I hadn't known before. Not pride, not defiance, just assurance, the kind that doesn't require witnesses. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't rehearsing apologies for existing. I wasn't afraid of being less. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing in the center of my own life, not at the edges, not behind the scenes, not waiting to be called forward. And in that place, something surprising happened. Love felt lighter, freer, less transactional. I could offer it without losing myself and withhold it without guilt. This peace wasn't borrowed from quiet days or cooperative moments. It was built, choice by choice, into who I had become. And once peace becomes part of your identity, no one can take it away from you, even the people you love most. As the days settled into this quieter rhythm, my thoughts began to drift backward, not with regret, but with curiosity. I started thinking about legacy, a word I used to associate only with what parents leave for their children: money, homes, sacrifices, stability. For most of my life, legacy meant depletion, giving until there was nothing left, then calling that love. But now, in this later season, the word began to shift its meaning. I asked myself a question that once would have frightened me. What am I leaving behind that isn't exhaustion? For years, I believed my greatest achievement was how much of myself I had poured out. I wore my tiredness like proof of devotion. Every missed dream, every delayed desire, every swallowed disappointment, I told myself it was all worth it. And perhaps it was. I raised my children with care, with presence, with steadiness. I don't deny that. But there is a truth I avoided for decades. Love that erases the self does not teach love. It teaches disappearance. That realization did not come with bitterness. It came with sadness first. A soft, aching sadness for the woman I had been, the younger version of myself who believed she had to earn belonging through endurance. I thought of her often, standing in kitchens late at night, saying yes when she meant no, smiling through fatigue because she thought that was strength. For the first time, I didn't judge her. I forgave her. Self-forgiveness is a strange thing. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a hand resting on your shoulder when you finally sit down. I forgave myself for not knowing sooner, for confusing duty with love, for thinking my value was measured by usefulness. I began to see that I hadn't failed myself. I had simply lived within the limits of what I was taught. And now I was choosing differently. That choice mattered more than timing. Legacy, I realized, is not just what children inherit, it's what they witness. They watched me grow tired. They watched me overextend. They watched me disappear into responsibility. Now they were watching something else. They were watching me rest. They were watching me choose. They were watching me become visible again. Even if they never spoke of it, even if they resisted it, that image mattered. Because someday, perhaps without realizing it, they would remember that their mother did not vanish entirely, that she learned, even late, to stand upright in her own life. I stopped apologizing for my age, too, for slowing down, for no longer being endlessly available. Aging, I discovered, was not a narrowing, it was a distillation. Everything unnecessary fell away. What remained was truth. And truth has weight. I thought often about the word sacrifice, how casually it's praised, how rarely it's questioned. I used to believe sacrifice was love's highest form. Now I understood something gentler and far more sustainable. Love does not require self-erasure to be real. Love can exist alongside boundaries. Love can survive disappointment. Love can remain even when sacrifice ends. This understanding softened my relationships in unexpected ways. When my children spoke of their struggles, I listened without assuming responsibility for fixing them. I offered empathy, not rescue, presence, not depletion. It felt strange at first, like holding something precious without gripping it too tightly. But slowly, I noticed how conversations changed. There was more honesty, less performance, less emotional negotiation. I was no longer trying to prove my love through effort. I let it exist quietly, without theatrics. And something else happened, something deeply personal. I began to imagine a future that included me, not just as a background figure, not just as a resource, but as a person with mornings to herself, thoughts that mattered, time that belonged to no one else. That vision didn't feel selfish, it felt restorative, like returning something that had been borrowed for too long. I started writing again, not for anyone else, not to preserve memories, but to hear my own voice. Pages filled slowly, memories surfaced, some painful, some warm. I didn't rush them, I let them arrive as they were. In those quiet hours, I understood something fundamental. Legacy is not built by how much we give up, but by how fully we live, honestly, visibly, intact. My children may remember many things about me, my cooking, my patience, my constancy, but I hope above all they remember this version too, the woman who learned that love does not require disappearance and that devotion can coexist with dignity. I stopped asking myself whether I had done enough. Instead, I asked something truer. Did I finally allow myself to exist? The answer, at last, was yes. And in that yes, I felt something settle, not just peace, but reconciliation with my own life. I wasn't rewriting the past, I was reclaiming the meaning of it, allowing love to expand beyond sacrifice, beyond exhaustion, beyond obligation. This was not an ending, it was a redefinition, and it changed the way I understood everything that came before. Time has a way of loosening what once felt fixed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, like a knot that has been pulled at for years finally giving way, strand by strand. As months passed, I noticed that the roles I had carried for so long no longer clung to me with the same urgency. Mother, fixer, emotional anchor, the one who remembers birthdays, smooths over tensions, absorbs discomfort so others don't have to feel it. Those roles didn't disappear, but they softened. They stopped demanding constant proof. And with that softening, something unexpected happened. My relationships began to breathe. At first, the change felt subtle. Conversations with my children became less guarded. They didn't call as often, but when they did, the calls were quieter, more real. There was less urgency in their voices, less expectation hidden between words. They no longer spoke as if I were a solution waiting on standby. They spoke to me as a person. That shift did not come because I demanded it. It came because I stopped performing. When I no longer rushed to reassure, they learned to sit with uncertainty. When I no longer apologized for having limits, they learned to respect them. When I no longer filled every silence, they learned to speak honestly. It surprised me how quickly the dynamic changed once I stepped out of the center of responsibility. For years, I believed that if I loosened my grip, everything would fall apart, that love depended on vigilance, that peace required constant effort. But what actually fell away was strain. I remember one afternoon vividly. My eldest called, frustrated about a situation at work. In the past, I would have listened with my whole body leaning forward, heart racing, mind searching for advice, solutions lining up before he finished speaking. That day, I listened differently. I stayed present, but grounded. I didn't rush to fix. I didn't take ownership of his stress. I said something simple. "That sounds heavy. I trust you'll find your way through it." There was a pause on the line. A long one. Then he exhaled, deeply, audibly. "Thank you," he said. "That actually helps." I hung up the phone and sat quietly afterward, letting that moment settle into me, not because I had done something extraordinary, but because I hadn't. I had allowed him his strength, and in doing so, I honored my own. Peace, I learned, does not always announce itself internally. Sometimes it reveals itself through others, through the way conversations slow down, through the absence of urgency, through the feeling that you are no longer being pulled from the center of your chest. I began to notice peace moving outward, touching corners of my life I hadn't expected. Friends I had quietly neglected because I was always too busy being needed elsewhere, drifted back into my days. We met for tea. We walked slowly, stopping whenever our needs demanded it. There was laughter that didn't rush toward meaning, stories that didn't need conclusions. These friendships felt different now, less transactional, less bound by obligation. We spoke openly about aging, about regrets, about the relief of no longer pretending we had endless energy. There was comfort in that honesty, in being seen without being useful. Even my relationship with silence changed. I used to fear quiet moments. They felt like failure, evidence that I wasn't doing enough. Now, silence felt earned, restful, like a pause the body recognizes as safe. I could sit alone without feeling lonely. I could wake up without a list of responsibilities pressing into my thoughts. That kind of peace is not loud. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't perform. It simply stays. I noticed, too, that my children began adjusting their expectations, not with resentment, but with acceptance. They planned differently, asked before assuming. Sometimes they even checked on me, not because they needed something, but because they wanted to know how I was. "How are you doing, Mom?" The first time one of them asked that without urgency behind it, I almost laughed, not out of bitterness, but surprise. The question landed differently now. It wasn't a prelude to a request. It wasn't a courtesy. It was genuine. I answered honestly. "I'm well," I said. "I'm peaceful." And I meant it. What I realized then was something quietly profound. Peace, once established within, becomes permission for others. It teaches without instruction. It invites without force. It shows that love can exist without constant sacrifice, without self-neglect. By choosing myself, I hadn't withdrawn from love. I had refined it. My children were learning, perhaps unconsciously, that relationships do not have to be built on depletion, that care does not require collapse, that presence can be offered without losing oneself. And I was learning something too. that it is never too late to change the emotional climate of your life, that old roles are not prisons, they are habits, that peace, once practiced, becomes contagious. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Old reflexes don't disappear entirely. Sometimes I felt the urge to step back into overfunctioning, to rescue, to smooth, to absorb. But those urges passed more quickly now. I recognized them for what they were, echoes, not commands. I would take a breath, I would pause, I would choose differently. And each time I did, peace deepened its roots, not just inside me, but around me. My home felt lighter, my conversations felt cleaner, my days felt like my own. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to rest, to enjoy, to exist as myself. I had given that permission, and the world, surprisingly, had adjusted. Time hadn't taken anything from me in this season. It had given something back. And as I looked ahead, not far, just enough, I felt no fear, only a quiet readiness for whatever came next, because I was no longer living in reaction. I was living in alignment. Peace was no longer something I borrowed between responsibilities. It was the ground I stood on. Closure does not arrive like a door slamming shut. It arrives like a lock finally turning, softly, almost without sound, after years of trying the wrong keys. I didn't wake up one morning and declare myself healed. There was no ceremony, no announcement to the world that I had chosen myself fully and without hesitation. Instead, clarity crept in during ordinary moments, while folding laundry slowly, no longer rushing, while choosing what to eat based on appetite instead of habit, while saying, "not today," and feeling no need to explain. That was when I realized something important had shifted. I was no longer negotiating my worth. For most of my life, my sense of value had been tied to responsiveness, to how quickly I answered, how much I gave, how little space I took. Love, I believed, was proven through availability, through sacrifice so quiet it almost erased the person making it. But now, at this stage of my life, that belief no longer held. I began to see my past with a gentler clarity, not as a series of mistakes, but as choices made with the understanding I had at the time. I stopped judging the woman I used to be for not knowing what I know now. She did the best she could with the tools she had, and she carried a lot with very little recognition. That realization felt like forgiveness, not the dramatic kind, but the kind that settles the body. I forgave myself for staying too long in patterns that drained me, for confusing endurance with love, for believing that being needed was the same as being cherished, and in forgiving myself, something loosened further. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped imagining explanations I would never give, stopped waiting for apologies that might never come. I understood then that closure doesn't require agreement from others. It requires acceptance from yourself. My children did not suddenly become different people. They didn't transform overnight into deeply reflective versions of themselves who fully understood the weight I had carried. And that was okay. Their journey was theirs. Mine was finally my own. What mattered was this: I no longer needed them to validate my choice. The quiet power of choosing oneself is that it doesn't argue, it doesn't convince, it doesn't seek approval. It simply stands firm, calm, rooted, unmovable. I noticed that when I spoke now, my words carried less urgency and more truth. I didn't soften them to make them easier to digest. I didn't sharpen them to make a point. I just spoke plainly. I'm comfortable with my life now. I'm not available for that. I need rest. Simple sentences, powerful boundaries. And the world adjusted, not because I demanded it, but because I stopped bending. There was one moment in particular that felt like the final turning of the key. A family gathering, small, quiet, the kind I once would have exhausted myself preparing for, emotionally and physically. This time, I arrived rested. I stayed present. I listened more than I spoke. At one point, a familiar expectation surfaced, a subtle one, a glance, a pause in conversation that used to signal it was my turn to step in, to smooth something over, to fill the gap. I noticed it, and I did nothing. The moment passed. Someone else spoke. Someone else adjusted. The world didn't collapse, no one was harmed, and something inside me settled permanently. That was it. That was the proof. I was no longer essential to everyone else's comfort, and I was finally essential to my own. As the evening ended and I returned home, I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Not pride or victory, just rightness. The kind that comes when your inner life and outer choices finally align. I sat alone that night, not lonely, just alone, and reflected on the years ahead. There were fewer of them now than there once were. That truth no longer frightened me. It clarified me. I didn't want to spend what remained apologizing for existing. I didn't want to shrink to make others comfortable. I didn't want to trade peace for approval ever again. Choosing myself fully didn't make me colder, it made me clearer. I loved my children, not less, but differently, without fear, without bargaining, without self-erasure. Love no longer felt like a test I had to pass. It felt like a choice I made freely. And that, I realized, is the most honest form of love there is. As I prepared for bed that night, moving slowly, deliberately, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Older, yes, softer in places, lined by years of giving, but there was something new in my eyes. Presence, grounding, peace that didn't ask permission. I smiled, not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because I had, and that was enough. In the end, life does not ask us how much we endured. It asks us what we learned from it. I used to believe that if I kept giving quietly, endlessly, something would eventually balance out, that love would circle back, that sacrifice would be noticed, that one day someone would look at me and say, "You don't have to carry this anymore." But life does not always offer that moment. Sometimes the moment comes only when you give it to yourself. As I sit here now, looking back across the long stretch of years behind me, I see my life not as a single story of loss or devotion, but as a series of seasons, each one teaching me something I could not have learned any other way. In my early years, I learned how to care for others. In my middle years, I learned how to endure. And now, in the later chapter of my life, I have learned how to remain. Remain present, remain honest, remain whole. What surprised me most was not that choosing myself brought peace, but that it brought clarity about love itself. I used to think love meant disappearing quietly so others could stand comfortably in the center. I thought it meant absorbing disappointment so no one else had to feel it. I thought it meant proving again and again that I was useful. Now I understand something gentler and far stronger. Love is not measured by how much of yourself you give away. It is measured by how much of yourself you are allowed to keep. When I stopped living in constant reaction to my children's expectations, something unexpected happened. My love for them became cleaner, less tangled, less resentful. I no longer loved them out of obligation or fear of being abandoned. I loved them because I chose to, and choice changes everything. There is a quiet dignity that comes with no longer pleading to be understood, with no longer reshaping your truth to fit someone else's comfort, with no longer explaining why your limits exist. At this age, I do not raise my voice, I do not demand recognition, I do not seek permission. I simply live honestly. I wake when my body is ready, I rest without guilt, I speak only when I mean it, I stay silent when silence feels truer. And in that simplicity, I have found something rare, contentment that does not depend on anyone else's approval. If I could speak to the woman I once was, the one rushing through her days, the one measuring her worth by how needed she was, I would not scold her, I would not rush her, I would sit beside her and say this: "You are allowed to take up space, even if no one claps. You are allowed to rest, even if someone disapproves. You are allowed to choose peace, even if it disappoints the people you love, especially then. Because here is the truth I wish I had learned sooner. The people who truly love you will adjust, and those who don't were never meant to own your peace." As time moves forward, my life grows quieter, but not smaller. It feels more intentional now. Every choice carries weight. Every relationship has shape and boundary. I no longer confuse chaos with connection. I have learned that peace is not passive. Peace is an active daily decision to honor yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's lonely, even when it goes against everything you were taught to believe about love. And that decision, once made, changes the way you walk through the world. You stand straighter, you breathe deeper, you stop apologizing for your own existence. At 78, I did not become selfish, I became honest. I stopped asking who needs me and started asking, what do I need to remain whole? That question saved me, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And if there is one thing I hope remains with you long after this story ends, it is this: you can love deeply without disappearing. You can care without carrying everything. And it is never too late, not at 78, not at 79, not ever, to choose peace and still call it love. That is the quiet strength no one teaches you.